What do they think is going to happen? This is what theologian Adam Costco said to a student who asked, if all the legitimate democratic means for creating change are cut off, what are we supposed to do? Are you advocating violence? Costco was on a panel commemorating Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom, and talking about the growing number of ways that the will of the American people has been thwarted by gerrymandering and the Senate filibuster and the Electoral College and the Supreme Court, all of which, he said, will be intensified if Donald Trump regains office. But Costco said in response to the student, no, I'm not advocating violence. I'm just pointing out that the far right has created a situation in which the American people have been left without any nonviolent means of creating any kind of society that they want to live in. And so he simply asked, what do they think is going to happen? The far right's answer to the question is simple. There will be blood. On Monday, Kevin Roberts, the leader of the Heritage Foundation and the creator of the ultra-fascist Vision for America Project 2025, said, in spite of all of the nonsense from the left, we are going to win. We're going to take this country back. We are in the process of a second American Revolution. And then he said this, which will remain bloodless only if the left allows it to be. Only if the left allows it to be. This is a threat that implies an expectation of violence from the left in response to the implementation of their draconian vision. If you haven't heard of Project 2025 yet, it includes a plan to dismantle the state by removing employment protections for federal employees that have been in place for 135 years, making civil servants easier to fire and replace with right-wing loyalists. After that, Project 2025 plans to eliminate the Department of Education, reduce the scope of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, cut back on benefits for veterans, roll back renewable energy programs, limit mail-order abortion pills, and remove all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the federal government. 4 years have passed since George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis, sparking a racial reckoning. However, many scholars now believe the reckoning is long over, and that white backlash against the movement for Black lives has birthed a more monstrous and brazen fascism in its wake. Many insurrectionists who attacked the Capitol on January 6 were not held accountable. Conservative campaigns and book bans against teaching critical race theory, slavery, black history, and diversity, equity, and inclusion are sweeping across the country at an alarming rate. Last June, the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade and affirmative action. Donald Trump is once again the Republican nominee for president, promising to root out, this is a quote, the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. And this past Monday, the Supreme Court granted him immunity in all official actions, which experts say will go down in history as a day far worse for America than January 6th, as it gave Trump and all future presidents permission to break the law without consequences. If you're not concerned about the future of America, you should be. The last week has been especially bleak, and everyone I've talked to has been carrying the weight of civic depression. The common refrain that I hear over and over again is, things are so bad right now. Things are just so bad right now. It's easy for us to be mired in a fog of disappointment and despair. Generally, we feel like the only thing we have the strength to do right now is to get up in the morning, brace ourselves for the news again, speculate on the latest palace intrigue, desperately tell our friends and neighbors to vote, then hold our breath and wait, hoping to God we wake up in some semblance of a democracy on November 6th. If we take the headline seriously, it sounds like everyone believes we are on the brink of the end of democracy. Last November, opinion writers at The Hill claimed that the 2024 election could be the end of democracy. In January, Bernie Sanders said if Trump wins, it will be the end of democracy. A deluge of articles came out in February after Jack Posobiec told the crowd at CPAC, "We are here to overthrow democracy completely. We didn't get there all the way on January 6th, but we endeavored to get rid of it nonetheless." In March, Trump predicted that if he loses, it will be the end of democracy. The urgency of the current moment has got everybody. Just this week, MSNBC host Chris Hayes said we can't let Trump win or it will end our democracy. Americans seem to be living in apocalyptic anxiety. Whenever I hear someone write one of these articles or say this on NBC, I think of that Jim Morrison singing for the Doors, that haunting song, crooning, "This is the end, my only friend, the end." It's just so apocalyptic. If you're Gen X, maybe you're thinking of the REM song, "It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine." But we don't feel fine, do we? Is it really the end of democracy? Is that what we're facing? And how are we called to live in such an apocalyptic moment? It is almost universally agreed that the Gospel of Mark was written in 69 AD, in the middle of the Jewish-Roman War. Widening gaps between the wealthy aristocracy and the poor had led to an economic crisis. And in 66 AD, 3 years before, an army of Jewish zealots had led a rebellion, defeated the Roman 12th Legion, captured Jerusalem, liberated Palestine, and installed a provisional government of their own. Humiliated by the defeat, the Roman Emperor Nero sent his top general, Vespasian, with 4 legions back to take Judea. Despite heroic Jewish resistance, Vespasian captured Galilee and western Judea in short order. By June of 68, he was preparing for a siege of Jerusalem when something unexpected happened. The Emperor Nero died, and Rome became locked in a civil war with 4 candidates vying for the throne. Vespasian was recalled to the capital, and the Jewish rebels in Jerusalem believed that God had saved the holy city with a reprieve of a year and a half to prepare for an inevitable confrontation with the Roman army. Vespasian would go back to Rome and prevail as emperor and then send a new general, Titus, to finish off the Palestinian rebels and destroy Jerusalem. Titus would begin his siege in April of 70 AD, and after 5 months of high-pitched battle, Jerusalem would fall and the temple would be burned to the ground. But in that period of 69 AD, a year and a half, when Mark's gospel was written, the Jewish resistance in Jerusalem believed that God had intervened on their behalf, a sure sign of the Messianic age. And they conjured that old myth of restoring the Davidic monarchy and went through Palestine, calling on all the faithful Jews to join them for their final battle to defend the city of Jerusalem. All true Jews, they said, should take up arms and defend the holy city from their Roman oppressors. Zealots at this time were even successful at recruiting followers of Jesus out of the church, convincing them that their holy war was a critical event that would hasten the return of the Messiah. The apocalyptic fervor surrounding the war put the church in Antioch, where Mark's gospel was written, in a very precarious situation. In fact, the very reason Mark may have written this gospel in the first place could have been to help the church to navigate and respond to this moment in the midst of a war. Mark was concerned about the danger the war posed to his community. People were sympathetic to the fight against Roman oppression. Many believed the end was at hand. Some had already been drafted into the war. Others were sorely tempted to join. Who could resist the lure of patriotism and ethnic and national pride, the hope that the long-deferred promise of a final battle where God would vindicate Israel from its enemies once and for all had finally come? The critical question was, should the followers of Jesus take up arms in a holy war to violently defend the city of Jerusalem against the Romans? And Mark's answer to this question was a resounding no. And in such a moment, he knew there was only one voice that he could summon to match the persuasive call of the rebel recruiters. And so Mark employed the words that Jesus gave to his own disciples about the destruction of the temple to try and address the conflict that his community found itself in during the height of the Jewish-Roman war. Instead of calling people to defend the temple, Jesus had predicted its destruction. The disciples were astonished by this teaching, and so they approached Jesus in private for a deeper explanation, as they often did when they were very confused. And their questions to Jesus were twofold. When will these things happen? And what will the sign be that they have been accomplished? Basically, when is it going to happen? How will we know? And these are perfectly legitimate questions that we can all relate to. We're similar to the disciples. We want answers to our questions about America, about democracy. We want to know the time. We'd love to have some kind of sign. It would be fantastic if Jesus would just go ahead and tell us when democracy is going to end and what kind of sign we should look for. We could plan our move to Canada that we've been talking about for 8 years. We could move to Oslo, as somebody told me during the passing of the peace. We could pull our money out of the bank. We could build a bomb shelter. We could hide out in the mountains. It would be nice to know when it's all going to happen, because the anxiety that we feel about the future is often the result of not knowing what's going to happen and when. We're constantly doom scrolling the news media, thinking to ourselves, Lord, give us a sign. Give us a sign. Which way is it going to go? But Jesus, you may have noticed, would not tell his disciples when or give them a sign. Instead, he said, beware no one leads you astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of war, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Contrary to the way these apocalyptic words have been used by evangelicals to scare us all into thinking we're in the end times right now, Jesus actually argued the opposite. His vision conflicted with the zealots' hopes of revolution because he refused to connect the cataclysmic events of his time with the end of history. The evangelical interpretation of this passage has more in common with the zealots who were recruiting support for their messianic war than it does for Jesus. Jesus took sharp issue with that interpretation and proclaimed an alternative truth. All the wars and rumors of wars, the cataclysmic political events, all the natural disasters are not, in fact, the end. They are the beginning. They are the birth pains of a new reality that is coming into being. I often wonder if every generation mistakenly imagines that our situation is more apocalyptic than the generations that have come before us. When we look at Christians over the past 2,000 years, it's astonishing how many believed that they were living in the end times and were not. Yes, we're living at a time when American democracy seems precarious, but we're not living during the Jewish-Roman War, or the destruction of the temple, or the obliteration of our entire way of life, at least not yet. The Roman army is bearing down on Jerusalem. Followers of Jesus are being recruited by the zealots. The threat of violence and destruction was at an all-time high. In fact, we know the temple was destroyed less than a year after Mark's gospel was written, and yet Jesus still proclaimed it was not the end. People who proclaim that the end has come can be incredibly persuasive. They can incite good people into violent activities. As Voltaire once said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. But Jesus did not threaten people with apocalyptic rhetoric. Instead, he cautioned his followers, don't be led astray by that. Don't be led astray by wars or rumors of war, natural disasters, apocalyptic calls for violence, or false prophets telling you that this is the end. Don't be led astray by that. It may feel like the end. It may look like the end, but it is not the end. It is only the beginning, he said. These are the contractions of a new creation. There is something incredibly counterintuitive and hopeful in Jesus' words, which Mark used to encourage his community. He made no pretensions about Roman power, no illusions about the destruction of the temple, and yet Jesus also refused to condone the zealots' violence, to consent to their claims that it was the end of history, or to permit his followers to participate in a war against Rome. His message was not one of passivity or withdrawal, and he would not even entertain the idea of collaboration with their Roman oppressors. In contrast, Jesus offered a third way, calling his followers to engage in two holy activities in the midst of the dire situation that they faced. He said, watch and preach. Now, I know that doesn't always sound very comforting. We may want Jesus to say something stronger, like fight, protest, organize. But instead, he said, do not be led astray by apocalyptic anxiety. Instead, you must keep watch and preach the gospel. What did he mean by that? And how is that going to help us change the world or survive in the midst of this? Well, we know what it means to preach. We've heard it all of our lives, to proclaim the good news of Jesus. To preach is to proclaim the good news of love and justice, life and peace, grace and truth, liberation and release. It means to proclaim this message of love and justice with our bodies, our lives, our resources, every single day, and when necessary, to use words. It means that no matter how bad the news becomes, we still have good news in our hearts to hold as hope and to hand on to our neighbors who are hurting. And it's not just good news for Americans, but if you read in the passage carefully, good news is for all the nations, for all the people of the earth. Now, we might forget about the good news or get so overwhelmed by bad news that we have a hard time believing in the good news, but we still know what it means to preach. And the good news is always there, always available, ready whenever we are to be embraced and shared, like a word of love or a loaf of bread or a simple act of hospitality. The good news of God's kingdom, the good news of a different reality, must be shared as an antidote to the bad news of our world. And so Jesus said to us in the midst of this bleak time, preach and keep on preaching. But he also said watch, which is harder for us to understand. It's a command that comes up often in the Gospels. Beware, watch out, don't go to sleep, stay awake, wake up. All these are varieties of the same Greek word, the same command. And Jesus even told parables with this at the end as an imperative. It was his unique way of calling his followers to vigilance and faithfulness in the midst of a time of trials and tribulations. To be vigilant, though, is not to be violent, nor is it to fall into escapism and fatalism and despair. It is to live as an alternative witness, engaged in the work of active resistance to the forces of greed and violence and oppression and injustice in our world. Jesus called his followers to resist, but unlike the zealots, his call was always to resist nonviolently. To participate in violence of any kind, whether revolutionary or state violence, does not actually change things at the fundamental level. The zealots employed violence to reconsecrate the old order and reform the state of Israel and to reestablish the monarchy, and they were completely destroyed. But Jesus called for more fundamental change at the root, a complete unraveling of the old system, a total overturning of the established order. He called his followers to embrace life as if it were a permanent garden of a Gethsemane, to stay awake in the darkness of history, to refuse to compromise with the politics of death, and to engage vigilantly in the nonviolent resistance against the powers of violence for the sake of trying to create a beloved community of justice and peace. As Dr. King proclaimed, the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is the descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding a deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, he famously said. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. King also said violence never brings a permanent peace. It solves no social problems. It merely creates new and complicated ones. It destroys community and makes solidarity impossible. It leaves us in a monologue rather than a dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. As people of faith and good conscience in America today, we are as anxious about the downfall of democracy as the disciples were about the destruction of the temple. And just like then, there are wars today and rumors of war. Violence and rumors of future violence. Everyone seems to be saying that the end has come. False prophets on all sides are recruiting people to their ranks. Many are asking, when will the destruction happen? What will be the signs? What should we do? Should we fight? Is this really the end? Jesus' words pierce through the cacophony of questions, through the apocalyptic anxiety of our age with a clarion call. Do not be led astray. There will be roars and rumors of war, and violence and rumors of violence, false prophets and fake news, nation rising against nation, faction against faction, party against party, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, there will be earthquakes, there will be hurricanes. There will always be people trying to convince you that this is the end, but do not be alarmed. Do not be led astray. This is not the end. The end is yet to come. You have heard it said, this is the end of democracy. But Jesus says, this is only the beginning. You have heard it said, this is the end of the church. But Jesus says, this is only the beginning. You have heard it said, this is the end of America, but Jesus says, this is only the beginning. You have heard it said, this is the end of the world as we know it, but Jesus says, this is only the beginning. You've heard it said, this is the time for violence, but Jesus said, this is the time for the good news of love and peace and justice to reign. You've heard it said, this is the time for defending the old ways, but Jesus says, this is a time for a new beginning. It is a time for vigilance. It is a time for nonviolent resistance against the forces of injustice and oppression. It is a time for something new to be born in and among us. Yes, things may look bleak today. But we must understand that the pain and the struggle that we face before us right now in this moment is the birth pain of a new reality, the contractions of a new creation, the labor that comes before our delivery. We can't give up now. We cannot give up at this moment. We cannot be led astray. We must keep watch, like sentinels who shine like bright lights in the midst of the darkness. We must get out the vote like our lives depend on it, because they do. And we must preach the good news of love and justice until the world has time to begin again. This is not the end, my friends. This is a new beginning, and we need to learn to live like we're just getting started. Amen.